Hello and welcome back to the next segment here. We're still in the curriculum, still doing observable error recovering and reporting in the curriculum. And so we had just wrapped up the recovery step, which showed how to gracefully recover whenever you have an error in an observable that's continuously updating. And so now we're going to take a look at the other half of this, which is how we go about teaching how to report on the progress of observables. Now this is based upon some work that I'd actually done to replace this step, but as Bill pointed out, was actually getting rid of some good ideas by accident along the way. And so what we have, if we go to our curriculum, it's busted. Why is it busted?
Are you still offline?
It's still running. Hey, look at that.
Hey, there you go.
If we go back to the listing, this is the observable error reporting. And I believe if we watch very, very carefully when we show up, there's the loading indicator actually right here, very briefly, where it says request pending.
I wonder if you can change your network speed.
Well, we could change the network speed, or we could drop a delay in the actual observable itself, but I don't remember what the code does for this thing yet. So.
Yep. And so in here, let's not start with the template. Let's start with the actual component itself. We have an employee service, and that has a GetEmployees method. And then here we do a share replay on that GetEmployees. Reason being is because we're going to take that request and we're actually going to create a bunch of different observables off of it. And each of those observables represents a different fact about this request. This one actually represents the data that we hope to eventually get back. This one represents any errors that this request might be associated with. And this one represents the status of that request as to whether or not it's still in progress. And how we break that down is the request itself is more than just the piece of information that we behind the scenes made an HTTP request about. We actually annotated that request by including things like a status. And so here, when we kick off the request, we actually start by setting a status saying, hey, this is in progress, and there's no payload associated with it.
Well, when you say we set, you're clearly not talking about here, because this is actually checking those, so I'm assuming that's happening over in our service.
So our service, whenever it says, hey, I'd like you to go ahead and get some employees, it starts literally inside, we'll see in a moment, with a start with, where it says, please start with a thing that has a status saying that we're in progress. And then here it says, hey, go ahead and filter this down to only the ones that have errors. And this one says, please filter it down to only the ones that indicate success. And then on the template, we're piping each one of these asynchronously into its own individual display. So in the case of, hey, we're in progress, here we're just saying request pending. You could have used this in conjunction with a spinner or whatever at this point. And the idea is that as that request and flight changes over time, well, then it would automatically make that status go away.
It's like you were using that template variable and you're not anymore, the as in progress.
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah. And so similar story here. This one's only tracking errors so that it only shows in the case in which we actually have an error. And then this one says, hey, let me go ahead and access the employees, which will only be the ones that have employees attached to them. So we grab the results off of that and display the information about it. So over in the GetEmployees, this is where we actually let me study this for a second. I thought it was a start with that we would have seen here. So
yeah, it is on line 18. It's just at the bottom.
Ah, there we go. Yep. So we have make our HTTP request where we form up our URL. We pipe that into a map where we take any results that we would have expected to receive, and then we wrap this in an object that reports that it was successful. Here, in the case of errors, we say go ahead, catch an error, and return an observable, because that's what you actually need to do in your error handling branch, of an item here that reports that this was an error. And then lastly, kick off this whole process with an initial piece of data indicating that this is in progress.
So my first thought upon seeing this is, what is the return type of GetEmployees? Right?
Yeah.
So, because we're returning a whole bunch of different object shapes here,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we've got one that's got a object that has a list of the actual list with a status of success, one that has a status and then an error, and then one that just has a status.
Yep.
So
Typically, so this is again the starting point to catalyze the conversation, not the actual proposal.
Mm-hmm.
And so typically I would then follow this up with an actual interface.
Yep, that's where I was trying to get you to go.
Export interface, and then the interface would be, in this case, something that actually indicates that this is about the status of the request, or rather, like it's about the request itself, not the data. So this would be something like an employee request update. But again, actually in the applications I build this out as a generic mechanism that all of these requests
I was going to say
use.
that this actually is generic, and I would either make this a generic interface or rename the results property. Does that make sense?
What do you mean? Where
Like if this was an employee list, request update, don't have a property called results, have a property called employees.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, so that kind of like we're already at a kind of a decision point here. Do we want to go all the way towards showing a generic attempt at this, or do we want to?
I'm going to ask an even higher level question. Do we really need? Is there enough stuff in the existing, pieces that are provided by Angular's HTTP client, for example, to give us the things that we need without us having to wrap it up with something else? Feels like there might be.
If there is, I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, I don't know when you progress indicator. Like we could get a, whether it's an error or not.
I feel like I've seen stuff that would indicate that stuff's there, but I've never had to use it.
Yeah, I've always done something like this where I wrap up I make the pieces that I need, but honestly I haven't gone and looked hard enough probably at the other side of it to see, do I really need to do this myself?
Well,
I agree, there's not really an in-flight.
I'll further defend this in that, again, with a lot of your actual enterprise needs, you would go on to supplement this with even more information, such as retrying, falling back to, backing off, additional information that helps the UI about the semantics of what it means for your application to make a request, not the semantics of an individual HTTP call.
And where I was going to go with this is part of the reason that I've always ended up here as well is because I always need more than just the raw request response plus a little bit of status and error information. There's always more to that. I want us to come up with the most straightforward error reporting example that we can that's also reasonably realistic. And if this is the way to do it, then that's fine. I think I like the more generic approach than the something specifically about employees. But maybe depending on where it lands, maybe I'll change my mind.
So just a reminder, we have another step. Conrad's whiz-bangy report all the things of your request lifecycle with retry and exponential backoff.
The problem is that in most classes, we rarely get there. At least in my classes, we rarely get there. And frankly, even by the time that we would get there, even with the observable and HTTP stuff that people have learned, that one overwhelms people. Yeah. It really kind of blows their minds, which I love. If people really want to go into it, it's great. But it's got so much in it that it's hard to kind of suss out the pieces that people care about.
Yeah, and that's the motivation for why we wanted to come back and add this. Because to me, the key thing to get across is that the whole idea around error reporting and the progress spinner and all of that is to get folks to understand that the majority of that work needs to happen in the observable, not in your component.
Right. Absolutely.
And that's like the one thing everyone starts with. Oh, well, like when I make my request, when I press this button, I'm going to set a Boolean flag on my component that says I'm making a request. No, that always leads to trouble. This should help convey that point. Sorry, David, you're going to say something?
Going to Bill's earlier question of the success error in progress, like, is there something that Angular gives us? I mean, do we want to read the full response? Because we can get that by passing in the config object to the HTTP GET.
Oh yeah, we have access to it. But another thing to consider, and kind of what I expected people to say in response to my question, was this shouldn't just be about HTTP. We should make this so that however this request actually happens under the covers, this still makes sense. We don't want to tie it too closely to the way that HTTP works.
Yeah, so
Okay.
Again, how I've actually implemented this is just a generic mechanism that you handed an observable, and it will then go on to supplement it with these additional pieces of information.
I'm going to close the door. We're getting noisy outside.
One other thing separate from it, with success error in progress being strings, do we want to replace those with an enum or a constant?
I think so. We would, but for the...
I mean, in production code, I would, but for teaching, but then we all had the earlier conversation about setting best practice standards and them copying what we have exactly.
That might not be a bad idea here.
I mean, we are in the 700s, so I think if we show off some more advanced TypeScript features, that's a good thing.
I thought, when I was about to argue against it, I was thinking we were going to need to reference those enums in the template, which adds a little bit more, just another thing you have to do, but we're not doing that.
No, because it was in the component that I decomposed it into its bits necessary for that component to do its job.
Is request update now too specific of a name?
Well, what do you mean by request update here? What all are you going to put in there?
So this would be the packet, not HTTP packet, but like the bundle of information that will continue to come down all of your observable asynchronous requests.
Right. Is it going to optionally include results? Or
the idea would be that the results would be an optional property, and the error object would be an optional property.
Okay.
Yeah. So it would. Let me just.
Yeah. Go ahead and flesh it out, and then we can
have a status.
And would we want this to be called response update since it's a response?
Yeah, I was going to let Paul get all of his stuff in there and then argue with him about names.
Well,
all right.
This is not the I'm thinking it should be this. This is just stuff to get down the road. And then you've got your error, if any, which is of type
unknown.
Well, what is the proper type for errors these days?
What gets passed to catch error? Does it say? Or I guess it's whatever.
Yeah,
it's going to be an any.
Yeah.
It's going to be whatever it is. It's probably an any.
For the moment, it's an any. We don't love it, but it gets us where we need to go.
And then the actual results, is that what the other one was? Yeah. And then typically I actually come in here and then give it a type annotation.
Yeah.
It should be an array of T, right?
No.
Maybe. Don't know.
T could be an array.
I suppose. Yeah.
Like in this case, we would annotate it with an array of employees.
Yeah.
Now, which of these are optional? Error and results feel optional to me.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay.
So, I would argue that request. I mean, it has nothing to do with a request or a response. It has to do with an observable. And this could be literally any observable could be passed to this.
An observable for that.
And it would work.
Yes, observable of request update of. Do we have a type for our? We are not typing it.
We're about to have a type for it. I feel it coming.
Oh yeah, it's array of employee, and we can just copy that from somewhere else.
Yeah, I'm with Jack. I like it. I like it as these later examples are in these later examples to begin to show off more of what you can do with TypeScript. Really should be doing with TypeScript.
Well, I've made it very angry. All right, so this is.
I love how it's like, oh, go grab the employee from this totally different example. That
that we do not even have. Where do we put it in 706?
I will often put it in the service itself. So
Yeah.
Is employee something? Well,
Okay, so what's this thing complaining about? We've got it a little too loose on status. So this right here, type string is not assignable to success, error, in progress.
what?
So success, error, in progress. I spelt all those right?
Yes, this is something I've encountered when you try and type something like this, where if you set like a constant equal to something and then you set the value, it's fine. But if you try and like guard with the type, then it interprets the strings. It interprets your object on line 31, right, with the status. It interprets that as a string, not as the string success.
Yes.
And so then when it goes to try and figure out, it's like, oh, that's too generic, right, for the specific one. So I think an enum would solve this, which would be better, right, because then we're not just having magic strings
This might
in
just
our
be,
code.
might just be TypeScript forcing us in the right direction here by refusing to do the other thing.
Alright, how do I define an enum again? Is it just enum?
Yeah.
Yep.
This would be
And
the
you'll probably want to export it too.
statuses.
Status I.
Request
Status
update
on.
status. You should be
Yeah.
a
And
single.
how
right?
do I go
You
about
want
doing these
enum
again?
to be a plural.
It's like an interface, right, where you have a
Just go straight
curly
into
brace, yeah, and then
Yeah.
you do success, error, in progress.
Now these are identifiers on the
Yeah.
left?
There's no need. I mean, these don't need to be strings at this point.
Yeah,
Like
I
you
would
could just make this an enum.
Yeah, I would just list the
Success,
properties.
comma, error, comma, in progress.
And do you normally do it all caps like that?
I have
or is
seen
it-
folks do it because these are like constants,
yeah, but we got over
We
constants
did.
being all uppercase. So.
and I am okay with not.
I've done it with. I think the enum is proper case, and the
Yeah, that's right.
and the things inside are also proper case.
Mm,
No.
I agree with the enum should be proper case.
What's it whining about? It doesn't like the.
It's declared but never used.
Yeah, in the TypeScript documentation, they have the things inside. So status, error, in progress are proper case. Initial cap, basically.
What I call them statuses.
Mhm.
Dot. This is the good one. Alright, so that made that happy. That gave us our.
I hate the word statuses though.
That's fine. Let's see how many more of these names that we have to figure out before we start picking them.
Fair.
Yeah, and did we want to follow the TypeScript convention of the success being capital S,
Yeah, I mean probably.
etc.?
How good is VS Code at renaming that?
Should be pretty good.
I think it does it.
Not if I don't use the tools, it doesn't.
Okay.
So how did you do that? By the way, I'm not familiar with. I know how to do it in IntelliJ.
Is it just rename identifier?
Yeah.
Is that what it's doing?
Yeah.
F2 is the shortcut.
F2. Okay.
All right. Other thoughts? Other big structural things that we need to do before we start renaming things?
Go back over to your component for a second. So in here,
Do we have errors now? If you scroll down, yeah, because you're using an enum now, so you need to update that.
Yeah, I'm not exporting it yet.
So does everybody just export everything by default at this
No.
point now?
No, I certainly don't. I mean, typically the things that I'm building are small enough that exporting everything inside of them is not usually that big a deal. And by small enough, I mean I've divided it into small enough pieces that the things that I'm building probably need to be exported. But I don't just kind of default to that.
I would say normally, especially when I'm doing stuff in like a service, I normally have a different place where all my exported stuff is, and so I start by not exporting it because I assume it's going to be used locally here, and then if I realize I need it somewhere else, I take the whole thing and move it.
Yeah, I do a similar move, but I'm usually working with NX, so it's an even larger layer. It is like start with assuming it's a library, and then be very particular about what your interface API is.
Right. An example of a thing that I usually don't end up exporting is like little utility functions that only make sense in the particular place that I'm working. So if it's a service, if it's a component, and it has some sort of function that doesn't make sense to be a method on the class that I'm building, then that's not going to get exported. But those things often do end up in some sort of common utility library that lives somewhere else, and then it would get exported just to be used by the place that I created it.
Reason why div and no ng container? Or?
Well, we don't have actually a inner element to put it in. If we just said ng container, we would have to like move this into some sort of containing.
Yeah, if they were all 3 divs, then I would say wrap the whole thing, inside of an ng container or something. We'd probably reformat this, but I was actually wondering if this might be a place where we'd want to dig out the old NGSwitch.
On the request itself, on the status as you pipe async it.
Yeah, I don't know. This felt to me like this may be a good use case for NGSwitch, and I know we shy away from it, but
I could see working that in on one angle, but maybe having like more than one example, because I want to show how this information doesn't have to be tied up with an NGSwitch, because you could have it so that, and you likely will have it so that an NGSwitch actually isn't appropriate. Because what you most often will find is that you're actually doing this with a data table where you pass it a loading flag, or you're working with an error handler that you actually need to like go and use the error context in a completely different context, which is making a method call. So I want to save the notion of you can then split this into 3 streams and use each in its appropriate way. But I like the idea, like this is as I've made this example, it is an appropriate spot for a switch in the template. But I don't want to accidentally lose that decoupling and reusability.
Well, let's follow
of
this into its
statuses.
natural, conclusion, and then take a look at it. I kind of want to finish the thought that we're on, put it all in place, and then see if there's a way to make it better, or move, like you said, some of this stuff to an additional example that's like more of this technique. So I'm fine with keeping it the way it generally is. Now there is a reasonable question here that I can anticipate getting from students, which is like, and this is where I think you were going, why do I need 3 observables here instead of like having an observable that I can see what comes out of it and check the status on it? You gave me this status thing and optional errors and optional results, but now you've somehow sliced it up into pieces, and I got to look at all those individual pieces. Why are you making my life so hard, Paul?
Yeah.
There you go. That's I'm channeling my students.
And that's like when I come back with the thing I just told you. Yeah.
Okay, so keep that in your head. All right. Can you kill off the Explorer so we have more room to see stuff on the screen? Okay. There was one small thing that I wanted to ask you about down in the components Typescript. Line 42. Is there any reason that they're using a ternary there instead of simply saying results.status equals status is in progress? You're saying true and false, but the thing's going to be a Boolean anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, you could just delete the question mark to the end of the line.
Yeah.
Feels like that might be a leftover from when it wasn't a true or false thing.
Yeah. Well, and when
and all the others are
was like what you saw was actually the result of like me doing this on the fly, live coding,
Oh,
changing
yeah.
an existing example.
Hmm.
I just want to make sure I wasn't missing something that that needed to be there. But all right, so in the first two, we are deliberately only looking at things that are successful, deliberately only looking at like results or our request update objects that are errors, and then finally,
Wait,
oh, excuse me, the first one is actually we get things that are successful, therefore we have employees.
Right.
The second one is we got an error, and the third one is like we don't have results back either way yet.
I mean, this could be made to be enhanced so that it says, hey, what was it? What would we call it? Results. That's
No.
not so great.
Yeah, we got a similar thing going on with error up in the
Yeah.
template.
We can address that in a second here, but we could actually filter down to that and then map to that even, and then this would be the observable that just is the data, if that's helpful in any way.
I don't know. I think that might make things more complicated. More complicated to explain.
Start by renaming all of those results request. Or no, you can't, because you called that thing request.
All right. So this is our request for some employees.
Man, I wish we had some sort of naming convention to differentiate between the observable and the stuff inside the observable.
Nice. Nice.
Like a single character maybe?
Yeah, I don't know.
I know.
we should pick something that's not used very often, like maybe a dollar sign.
Yeah. I
The
like
trailing dollar sign.
You keep going, and I'll deny your trailing comments.
You already denied the trailing comments.
He deferred on that.
Let's trade him the comma for the dollar sign. Think that'd work?
Determine the gatekeeper.
So I missed
doesn't
this.
like
What
it,
happened
so
to
I'm
the
gonna
dollar
keep
sign?
Throwing
You guys
stuff at the
removed it?
gatekeeper.
Oh man, you don't even want to go there.
I
Go
missed the
watch some
conversation.
previous weeks.
Watch the videos.
Oh, you're just trying to get some views.
Yeah.
I refer to it as mud wrestling over finish notation.
Oh.
What'd you say, David?
I said go watch the videos.
Okay.
So I think I've actually used a word like this in the past. Like, because these like updates to your request that come through.
I get what you're saying, but I don't think it's clear here in context. It's the same thing I was concerned about with the name of the interface. Request update. Request update to me sounds like a verb. I am requesting that you update something. Update here sounds like a verb. Update is much more rarely used as a noun.
You could do something like just REQ.
Yeah.
If we're calling the observable request, that's something that's often done.
Well, but this isn't the request. This is the thing you got
This
back.
is actually the response.
Yeah.
Well, but this is
This
the
is-
no,
this
this
is one
it's
response.
the status of the request. It's not necessarily the response. It's the status of the request, along with any results that came back and any error. I guess
Well,
you're right. The error and the results are related to the response, but the status is related to the request.
No, because it is.
The
What is the
response
status
pending.
of this response that I just gave you?
Yeah, I think what we're doing here is conflating
Okay.
the HTTP request and response from the thing that we've wrapped around it. Like, we have requested a thing, we've gotten some sort of response back, and that response is this observable object wrapper thing that has a status, potentially an error, potentially results in it. So
And this is actually why I don't like the dollar here. Because the entity that I have represents my request, and responses about my request come back in it.
okay, I'm not going to argue about the dollar.
I think we should replace all of the S's in our code with the dollar sign.
I think that will solve all the problems about whether or not we
Yeah.
we add dollars to the end of our observables.
All right, so we're basically trying to not repeat the word results so that we have results. Like I said, same thing with error in the template. We had err.err in one place. It probably needs to be dealt with.
Yeah. We've also got any's on 25 and 26, and probably a line above it too. Nope, just those two.
Yeah, but this is actually now wrong because the idea wasn't finished. Because now it's still technically
Yeah.
an observable of the.
Whatever
The request
we're calling
update.
that thing.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead and at least put the name in there. We can change the name later.
The name here.
No,
No.
like the up on
Request
line
update.
25.
Sorry, I'm lost.
Right where you are, put in request update. Put in the right type
But again, this is not really.
of employee. Right.
Like calling that employees is not semantically correct in my opinion.
Right, and that's why I was trying to do this earlier. Is that either the name here needs to change or what it does needs to change. Because right now it is technically an observable that contains a request update that tells you whether or not the current response
Well, I think
has the
I
employees.
think we're
associated
kind of
with it.
narrowing into this. Probably should be, and let's talk about this. But I'm leaning toward it should be a single observable, and we shouldn't have 3 separate observables here.
Well, here's why where I am on it right now. I think that you are being victimized by the fact that you were 1/3 done with this thing before we started talking about it.
Right.
So I am of the opinion that we not sit here and beat on you about it. That you get a chance to actually get this closer to where you consider it finished, resolve some of the naming things, resolve like what you call the different wrapper layers, all that stuff, and then we review and refine that, as opposed to we sit here and argue about stuff that if you had 20 minutes alone with this code, you'd be done.
Yeah, that's probably fair.
I mean, I know that may go against the whole like let's mob this mother into submission, but I don't want to do that. You had a place you were going with this, and you were on your way there, and now we're just like throwing rocks at you from the side of the road. so let's let you get most of the way down the road, and then we'll throw bigger rocks at you at the end.
All right, I'm okay with that.
All right, let's go ahead and do that.
I was about to complain that I didn't even know we were throwing rocks yet, and I didn't even line up.